Hey, I'm Rob Witcher from Destination Certification, and I'm here to help you pass the new updated April 15th, 2024 exam. So as you have likely heard, if you're looking at this video, the CISSP exam is changing as of April 15th, 2024. So the new exam outline has already been announced to give folks like myself, the official authors of the official book, all sorts of other folks, time to update materials. And the new exam, when the exam will actually change, is on April 15th, 2024. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through all the various changes that have occurred between the most recent 2021 exam and the new one that'll go into effect in 2024. So my team and I have gone through and done a detailed analysis of exactly which sections have been removed, which topics have been removed, and what's been added and what's been changed. And so in this video, I'm going to start with a high-level overview of what's changed, and then I'm going to take you in fairly excruciating detail through all of the new material. And I think what you'll find incredibly helpful in this video, and this is why it's going to be a bit long, I'm going to walk through all the new material, and I'm going to teach you that new material. Before I get into that though, a few things I want to talk about. A couple of kind of frequently asked questions that I'm receiving all the time from our current students and people out there. First major question is like, how big of a change is this? And the answer is, it's pretty minor. Compared to some of the massive sort of tectonic changes that have occurred to the CISSP exam in the past, this most recent change is pretty small. For the most part, there's basically just been some new material that's added. So for example, and here's why I'm saying this, we've already started to do a really detailed analysis of like exactly what we're going to change in our book. So this is the book, right? Destination CISSP, a concise guide. We're already well into the process of updating our book. And I'm going to bet that 90 to 95% of the book is going to remain exactly as it is, wording-wise. And we're just going to be adding, we're going to be moving a couple things around, we're going to be renaming certain sections, and we're going to be adding new material to reflect the exam changes. Here's why I'm pointing this out. If you have existing CISSP study materials, they're still totally valid. There's nothing in any of the existing study materials out there that you need to ignore and be like, oh, that's not important for the exam anymore. That's definitely not the case. Essentially what this exam update is just adding some new, more recent material, some topics, concepts that are, evolving and becoming more popular in security history, things like SASE and stuff like that. I'll talk about what SASE is in a bit. So, important thing here. If you already have materials to study for the CISSP exam, you can keep using those materials. And you can use this video to figure out what new stuff that you need to know. And I'll teach you that new stuff. And so, it's not a massive change. That's the summary of what I'm trying to say here. All right, so let me start with the high-level overview of like the quick overview of what's changed. From a domain weighting perspective, there's been a 1% change. So here's the 2021 ratings and weightings, and here are the 2024 ones. And you can see all that happened is that 1% was removed from software development domain 8 and moved up here to domain 1. There's an important point I want to make here though. These domain weightings, I would suggest, are really not that important. When you sit down and you take the exam, you have to score at least 70% on the CAD exam. You have to score at least 70% on each of the 8 domains. And you really don't know, when you're reading exam questions, you're not really going to know, like there's no clear indication of what domain a question comes from. And what's really important is that you need to score at least 70% on each of the 8 domains. Hey, video editing Rob here. I asked the awesome Lou Hablas, our lead CISSP mentor, to review this video, and he had some awesome feedback that I want to share here. Hey Lou, I probably could have done a better job of explaining this pass rate thing. How do you describe this to our students?
Woo, okay, so yeah, that's a $64,000 Pandora's box question that everybody wonders about, Rob. I took the exam a bit more recently. I took it in July of 2020, and I think the exam's probably evolved a little bit over the years. But as I read things, as I understand things from my time prepping, and especially based on what I've read on ISC Square's website, again, they're a little bit dodgy, if you will, in terms of giving exact details about proficiency. They're vague. Yeah, dodgy is not maybe the right word. Sorry, ISC Squared. But they do point out a couple things. First of all, the algorithm works based on a 95% confidence interval. on a candidate's proficiency or lack of proficiency. As soon as that 95% confidence interval is reached, that showing a candidate more questions will result in a fail or result in a pass, then the exam ends with a fail or a pass. With regards to the specifics about how a candidate needs to do with regards to a given domain. Of course, we always tell our students, just be prepared to pass every domain. That makes it simple. Then you're going to pass. But they do point out that a candidate could score well in one or more of the heavier weighted domains and score less well, maybe to the point of being near proficiency or below proficiency, whatever the proficiency requirement exactly is in their algorithm. But a candidate could score near or below in a lesser weighted domain and then still pass the exam. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there, a little bit of, wondering exactly what the equation, what the algorithm ultimately points to with regards to exact proficiency level. But that's what they say. And so I generally tell students that if they have a question, but again, going back to the way we try and operate is we want to get our students prepared to pass every domain. So regardless of what the algorithm is saying or not saying, they're going to be fine in that regard. And then just one last thing is really, what ultimately boils down is one pass-fail result is being determined, and the criteria is 700 points. So if you want to say 700 out of 1,000 equals 70%, overall, then look at it from that perspective. But you don't necessarily need to consider being at 70% for every domain. You could be at 80% or 85 or 90 or 100% on a given domain, and maybe at 65 or 69% on another domain, and still pass the exam. But again, a lot of that's going to be weighted on the domain weightings themselves. And as everybody knows, domain 1 and domain 3 in our book, those are two of the heaviest weighted domains, and those are the two domains that we premise everything else on. Those are your foundational domains. So you do well on those, you're probably going to do well on everything else.
Right,
does it help, Rob?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, Lou.
So this is what we tell our students all the time. Honestly, just completely ignore these domain weightings. They're not important. What you really need to do is you need to make sure that you are familiar with all of the material in each domain. Because if you're unfortunate to not know, let's say, the material in asset security very well, even though it's not a very, suggesting to buy this, it's the least important domain. If you score below 70, if you score below proficiency, below 70% in, say, domain 2, you're still going to fail the exam. So I would ignore the domain weightings and absolutely focus on making sure that you understand all the major topics in each domain. And actually, a bit of a plug here. One of the good ways you can do this is we've made a set of mind map videos. You can find them here on YouTube. And in those mind map videos, we go through all the major topics in each domain. Watch those. It's a great way of kind of triggering yourself to sort of say to yourself, do I know all the major topics in each domain? And if there's stuff that you see in the mind map videos where you're like, I don't really understand that, that's a great trigger for you to go and dive deeper into that material. There's been a couple of other changes to the exam. So in 2021, on the current exam, you're going to see somewhere between 125 and 175 questions, and you'll be given 4 hours, which gives you somewhere between 1.4 to 1.9 minutes per question. In the updated exam, which will go into effect on April 15th, 2024, there's going to be 25 less questions, and you'll also be given an entire hour less time, only 3 hours in total. So that actually ends up giving you a little bit less time per question, 1.2 minutes to about 1.8 minutes. But I would suggest that this is not that big of a deal for most folks. We have hundreds of our students go through the exam, thousands of our students go through the exam every single year, and it is exceptionally rare that we hear from anyone that they were challenged for time on the exam. Most folks are able to complete the exam pretty easily, like well within 3 hours. And so given that there's 25 less questions, I would suggest that for most folks, 3 hours will be sufficient time. You'll of course have to keep track of time, but make sure you're not going to be going over, you've got to assume you might get up to 150 questions, so you have to pace yourself accordingly. But I would suggest for most folks, this is not going to be a major change. It's not going to add a lot of additional pressure on the exam. Okay, so let's now kind of start to get into a little more detail of what are the changes. And here's what my team and I have done. As I said, taken the entire exam 2020 outline and compared it to 2024. And here's the color coding. If I zoom out here, here's the entire exam outline. Anything that's been renamed in the exam outline or moved around, we've colored that in yellow. Anything that's been removed, we've colored that in red, and anything that's been added, we colored that in purple. And here's the breakdown of changes. None of the domain, at the domain level, none of them have been renamed or moved around. 6 of the subdomains, 6 of the sections have been renamed or moved around, and 65 topics have been renamed or moved around. None of the actual domains or subdomains have been removed. There have been 21 topics removed though. But as I said, for the most part, material from the pieces that have been removed, I would suggest have been kind of merged into other pieces. So there's really, if you've got an existing guidebook, if you're already studying for the exam, there's nothing that you can say, oh, I don't need to bother studying that for 2024. All the stuff that you're studying already is going to be important for the exam. And then here's the important part, and this is what I'm going to go through in detail in this video. There's one whole new subdomain in domain 3, I'll talk about that. And there's 31 new topics, and I'm going to go into detail on all of these. All right, so let's get into it. Let's start to get into the details. And we're going to go through this domain by domain, starting rather logically with domain 1 here. And here's the process. I'm going to walk you through line by line, essentially. And if anything's being renamed or moved around in yellow, I'm going to talk about that. A lot of it, I'm just going to say this is a minor rewording. You don't need to worry about this, or it's not, a significant change. If there is something that's significant that I think is worth talking about, I'll delve into it. And then, of course, anything that's new, I'll absolutely delve into in detail. So let's get into it. All right, first change here. The exam outline now talks about the 5 pillars of security. This is new wording in the exam outline, but this is absolutely not any new concepts. Let me show you. So in your studies, you've no doubt heard about the CIA triad being confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The 5 pillars of information security are the first 3 of the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then you add to that authenticity and non-repudiation. And these are absolutely not new concepts. Authenticity, non-repudiation, these have been on the exam for decades, frankly. Truly nothing new here. But this is really foundational stuff, right? And so here, I'll just give you some quick definitions of these things. So ultimately, what is confidentiality about? Put very simply, it's about preventing unauthorized disclosure of information. So if an organization has some sensitive secret information that other people shouldn't know about, confidentiality is about having the right controls in place to make sure that that information is not disclosed to those that shouldn't have access to it. Integrity is all about preventing unauthorized or unexpected changes to information. Important to highlight here, right? Sometimes you hear people talking about integrity is that it shouldn't be any changes to data. That's not right? We want data to be able to change. We want to be able to update things, improve our understanding, right? So integrity is not about preventing all changes to data, right? Integrity is about preventing unauthorized or unexpected changes to data, having corruption to your data, for instance. That's what integrity controls are in place for. Availability is, of course, to make sure that resources are available when the business needs them. Make sure the network is up. Make sure certain systems are up. That's what availability is all about. And it's crucial, right? Businesses nowadays cannot run without their data, without their systems. And so we need controls in place to make sure that we can achieve availability. Things like, clustering, redundancy, hot spares, warm spares, RAID, redundant sites, all that sort of stuff is what we can use to ensure availability. Authenticity is about being able to prove that something's legitimate or that you know who the sender of something was. So for instance, if you receive a file or an email from someone, authenticity would mean you know who the sender was. And that's why, and this is actually a really big hint for the exam, authenticity on the exam may also be referred to as proof of origin. In other words, you know where a message originated from. You have proof of that. That's what authenticity is all about. And then non-repudiation, put very simply, it's about not letting someone deny something. You can't deny something. So for example, a great example of non-repudiation is, let's say one bank sends a wire transfer to another bank. You would never want the receiving bank to later on say, oh, nope, I never received that $1 million, right? And then the originating bank would just, have to write that off or something. So this is what non-repudiation controls are for. So someone can't deny something. So if a bank transfer goes through, non-repudiation would mean that the receiving bank cannot deny that they received that transfer. When we talk about non-repudiation in relation to cryptography, there's 2 types of non-repudiation that you need to know about. Non-repudiation of origin and non-repudiation of delivery. Non-repudiation of origin means the sender can't deny they sent something, and non-repudiation of delivery means the receiver can't deny they received something. So you'll see non-repudiation in that context. You'll also see it in the context of logging and monitoring. If you've got log event data that shows a particular person doing something in a system, then you can achieve non-repudiation. They can't deny that they did that because you can say, look, we have the log event data right here. So ultimately, non-repudiation is about not being able to deny something. All right, so that's the 5 pillars. Again, nothing new, but I just thought I would start out with a bit of a deep dive into something. All right, there's a small rewording here. They just added the word sustain, not worth getting into. The exam outline now calls out a bunch of different frameworks and standards and so forth. Specifically, these are the ones that are called out in the exam outline now. Calls out ISO and NIST and COBIT and SABSA, PCI, FedRAMP. None of this is new. And in fact, I would suggest there's a lot more that you need to know about than just this. From a standards perspective, you should be familiar with these ISO standards, in particular, ISO 27001 and its companion document 27002. I'll talk about those more and even in a second more. Those are very important to know about. From a NIST perspective, you should be familiar with these standards. Very, very important is NIST 800-37, the RMF, Risk Management Framework. I'm going to talk about this more later. This is very important to know about. The other one that's a bit more important here is 800-53, the Cybersecurity Control Framework. And one other standard that you should know about is FIPS 140-3. This is a standard for basically assessing and rating cryptographic modules, things like TPM modules and so forth. So you should know about the FIPS standard as well. From a security control framework, I would suggest that you need to know these ones. And here's what I would suggest you need to know. Just know at a high level, what do each of these different security control frameworks focus on? In other words, what would you primarily use them for? Because there's lots of these, right? So which one are you going to use? And often the reason the organization cares about a control framework is because they have a contractual or regulatory requirement to be in compliance with this, right? PCI is a perfect example. If an organization is processing credit cards on behalf of Visa, MasterCard, etc., they're going to have to be PCI compliant. So know what each of these frameworks focus on, what they're particularly used for at a high level. As I mentioned, the 2 ISO standards, the 2 security control framework, well, actually, it's just 1 security control framework that you need to know about in a lot more detail is ISO 27001. ISO, the definition of what ISO provides is the best practice recommendations for an ISMS, an information security management system. You should know what that means. And the reason that ISO is so dominant on the exam is that if you were to sort of survey the world, I think you would find that ISO 27001 is the most commonly used security control framework in the world. It's pervasively used around the world. Very important security control framework, so definitely know a bit about it. And its companion document, ISO 27002. 27002 is not a control framework. It's a guidance document. 27002 is a much longer document because what it does is it provides guidance on how you'd implement all the controls that are defined in 27001. So be familiar with those. One other framework that I would make sure you're familiar with is the cyber kill chain or the cyber attack chain. So ultimately, right, this is a framework that we as defenders should be using to think about how can we prevent a breach? How can we prevent attackers from breaking into our environment? And the way we can do that is by thinking about how can we break the chain. If we can break even a single link in this chain, we can prevent attackers from progressing and getting into our environment. So you need to know about the cyber kill chain. You need to know the 7 steps: reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploit, installation, command and control, and actions. You need to know the 7 steps. You need to know the order of these steps. And you need to know, at least at a high level, what's happening at each of these steps. Like for example, at step 4 here, exploit. This is where the malware is exploiting a vulnerability in the target environment and managing to run in the target environment. So the way that we would break the chain here, right, is we would patch our systems. If we patch our systems, they won't be vulnerable. The malware can therefore not exploit that vulnerability. We can break the chain here, stop the attack from continuing. So be familiar with this. All right, and then the SABSA is noted. SABSA is an enterprise security architecture. There's 2 other major ones, the Zachman and TOGAF. I would not suggest these are particularly important for the exam, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time on these. Okay, they merged some subdomains here. Nothing very important, they just kind of stuck a couple of sections, subdomains together. This is a bit of a tongue twister. Moved from removed subdomain. There was a topic that was in the subdomain that was removed. One of the topics moved over here, so they just moved some material around. Nothing very important. They added the word assess to this sentence here. And I have to be really careful with this word assess because for the longest time, I didn't recognize or realize that assess is spelled with 2 S's at the end. And I actually did this for like a couple of years. In one of my slides, I had something about assessing something and I'd been speaking to it, I'd been teaching to it for years. And then someone finally pointed out, they're like, if that's missing an S on the end, right? It's not the word assess, it's a completely different word. So yeah, make sure you add that extra S at the end. Otherwise, it's a very different word. Okay. There's another new topic here related to external dependencies. So this is in relation to business continuity management. Business continuity management is the overall business function of being ready to respond to a disaster. So if some cataclysmic event occurs, some disaster happens, the business needs to be prepared for that. So that's why we do things like conduct the BIA, the Business Impact Assessment. And from that BIA, we define the key measurements of time, RPO, RTO, WRT, MTD. Based on those key measurements of time, we can then create plans, BCP, DRP plans. Related to this is to think about external dependencies. So the idea here is that if an organization is going to recover from a disaster, they can't do it all internally. There's certain things that they need vendors, contractors, service providers, utilities, companies to provide. For example, as part of responding to a disaster, a company might need to be running their backup generators. And then that brings into question how quickly can they get more fuel delivered to top up their fuel tanks? Because of course, if you're running your generators, you run out of fuel, you're not going to have any backup power. So an external dependency would be thinking about, okay, do we have a requirement to run our generators for 2 weeks? If we do, how much fuel do we have on site? If it's only 48 hours worth of fuel, we're going to need to make sure that some sort of company can drive over with a fuel truck and refill our tanks within 48 hours. And I'll give you a perfect example where this is important to think about. When a major hurricane hit Texas a few years ago, a ton of organizations, were suffering a disaster. They had to run on backup power. And of course, they had fuel contracts in place to get fuel deliveries. But because there was a state of emergency declared, any of those fuel contracts were essentially null and void. That fuel was being redirected to hospitals and police stations. And so all these companies that did have contracts in place to get more fuel delivered, those contracts were voided because a state of emergency was declared. And so what companies are doing now is they're often getting out-of-state contracts in place. So even if Texas declares a state of emergency, maybe fuel can be delivered from Alabama or Georgia or something like that. So this is what you're thinking about as part of external dependencies. You're thinking about what dependencies do you have, and you're devising strategies to mitigate potential disruptions, like for instance, getting out-of-state fuel deliveries. Okay, another minor rewording here, more minor rewording, more minor rewording. Next new thing, cybersecurity insurance. Overall, this is not a new topic. So this is overall one of the 4 ways that we can treat risk, right? There's 4 ways that we can treat risk. We can avoid the risk, we can transfer the risk, which basically means buying insurance, we can mitigate, and we can accept. So the only thing that's kind of new here is specifically talking about cybersecurity insurance policies. And of course, cybersecurity insurance policies are exactly what they sound like. These are specialized insurance products that will help organizations in the event of a breach or ransomware attack or something like that. Very, very important to remember here. If an organization buys any sort of insurance policy, cybersecurity or not, the organization is not transferring the accountability for that risk to their insurer, right? Because if you take our class, you'll know this, or if you read our book, accountability can never be transferred, can never be delegated. And so ultimately what these cybersecurity insurance policies are about is, like if a company gets breached, right? It's not like it's the insurance policy that's going to take the blame, or the insurance company that's going to take the blame for that breach, right? The organization that was breached will still be accountable for that breach. The purpose of buying a cybersecurity insurance policy is to help mitigate the financial costs. So if the company has to pay for a ransomware, like a ransom, or if they have to pay for breach investigation costs or for downtime to their customers, the cybersecurity insurance policy can help with these financial outlays. That's the idea here. But very importantly, right, an organization is not transferring the accountability of a risk to their insurance company. Only these things just mitigate the financial cost of the organization. Okay, minor rewording, nothing important. Rewording. There's a few of these. Okay, here is where some specific frameworks are called out again, but in this context, it's related to risk management rather than security control frameworks. And in fact, basically all the same frameworks are listed out again here. Here's what I would suggest though. The major framework that you need to know about from a risk management framework is the one I mentioned earlier, NIST 800-37, which is also known as the RMF, the Risk Management Framework. This is an incredibly important framework to know about for the exam. You absolutely need to know the 7 steps of the RMF, and you need to know what are the names of each step, right? Prepare, categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, monitor. You need to know the 7 names, you need to know the order of them, and you definitely need to know at a high level like this, what's happening at each step. I truly cannot emphasize this enough. Crucial to know for the exam. You really need to understand this. Okay. There's a bit of new material here around acquiring assets and some new terminology related to some risks associated with acquiring assets, things like tampering and counterfeits. So let me give you some definitions here. So let's start with product tampering. Tampering is where an attacker takes an existing product and they modify it in some way. For example, an attacker could get their hands on, say, a brand new keyboard. They could carefully open it up. They could solder a keylogger into the keyboard and then carefully put it all together, put it back in its packaging, shrink wrap the box, and then, deliver that keyboard to an intended victim. And of course, this victim would have no idea that the product had been tampered with because it was still, it was all shrink wrapped. So they wouldn't notice, and they'd plug the keyboard into their computer, start using the keyboard, and because the keyboard had a keylogger soldered into the inside of it, it'd be logging all their keystrokes. That's tampering. Tampering with an existing product, which is different from counterfeits. Counterfeits is where the attacker makes a new replica of the original product. So they make a fake, a counterfeit version of an existing product. And then the final one here is implants. And this is kind of what I just talked about, right? Implants is where the attacker stealthily inserts some product or some unauthorized activity into a system. So, putting a keylogger in a keyboard would be a perfect example of an implant. Or somehow building a backdoor into some open source software product. That would be an implant. Okay. What are some ways we can mitigate these risks? This is some other new material here. So here are some techniques that can be used to mitigate those risks that we just talked about there. All of these are listed, but none of these are new. Things like doing third-party assessments, minimum security requirements, etc. So I'm not going to talk about these. They were in the previous exam outline. What's new is this bit. For instance, Silicon Root of Trust. The idea here is that you can basically embed a cryptographic identity into some hardware, which allows you to then make sure that when that hardware boots up, it's a trusted piece of hardware and the code that is running is trusted. In fact, there's another term that is I would suggest, even more common in the industry. This is about having a secure boot process. The idea here being that, like, when you first power on the computer system and say before the operating system is allowed to load, or let's say the hypervisor, before the hypervisor is allowed to load, you'd want to make sure, like, is this actually the valid hypervisor, or has it been tampered with in some way? And so you can actually build hardware into, say, the CPU itself that is able to do a check to make sure that, is this the authentic hypervisor? Has it been tampered with in any way? Checks can be done before the hypervisor is allowed to load. And then you can kind of keep doing those checks the whole way up. Before the virtual machine is allowed to load, checks are done. Before certain software is allowed to load on the VM, checks can be done. And you can have this secure boot process. And it starts with the Silicon Root of Trust. You have to have this hardware capability built into, say, the CPU itself, embedded in the hardware, which allows you to establish the secure boot process. You can design hardware in such a way that it can be physically unclonable. You can basically build capabilities into hardware such that you can make sure that that hardware is unique and that it has an unclonable identity. So this is a great way of trying to prevent counterfeits, for instance, right? This is how you'd mitigate a physically unclonable function. This is how you'd mitigate the risk of counterfeits. And then another way is to think about your software bill of materials. I mean, and this goes back to the example I gave a second ago, which was talking about, could an attacker somehow, insert a backdoor into an open source piece of software, a library or something? So the idea of a software bill of trust is, Organizations should maintain a comprehensive inventory of all the open source software libraries, modules, tools that they use, and then be able to check to make sure that if they're downloading a new version of it, they can do checks on it to see what changes have been made and things like that to help detect and reduce the risk of, say, like a backdoor and being embedded in an open source software project. Okay, another minor rewording there, nothing major. And then one final thing to end off this section with here, and by the way, tea with lots of honey in it. My voice gets tired. I was teaching a lot today too, so there's lots of honey in this tea. Helps keep my voice alive. So final little thing here is it talks about in relation to security training, education, and awareness. You obviously need to keep your content up to date, your training materials, your educational materials. So you need to do content reviews. And it specifically calls out that you should look to make sure that your material is updated for cryptocurrencies, AI, and stuff. But honestly, this is nothing new. I mean, of course, forever, right? You always have had to think about, if you have training, education, or materials, you need to be constantly updating these materials because the world is constantly changing. So whatever new emerging trends are out there, you need to kind of look at these things and make sure that you are adapting, updating your training to account for these emerging trends, AI, blockchain, whatever it might be. So honestly, this is nothing new. Okay, that was domain 1. Let's move on to domain 2. And domain 2 is going to be super, super easy because there are no changes. So that's domain 2. Super easy. Let's now get into domain 3. And this is the biggest domain. But there's actually not that many changes. There's a couple of new items. And the big thing here is there's a whole brand new section. But it's actually not as big as change as you might think it is. I'll show you here in a second. So again, let's go through it line by line. All right, there's a minor rewording here where the old exam outline, it just said keep it simple, the KISS principle, but now they've clearly defined that what they mean by keep it simple is keep it simple and small. Maybe they wanted to clearly define that because I would suggest a more common version of the KISS principle is keep it simple stupid. That's certainly how I remember it. But they're pointing out here that what they mean by the second S there in the KISS principle is keep it simple and small. And this is a very good idea. When you are building any sort of system and you want to make it a secure system, the less code there is, the less chance there are for vulnerabilities, right? Economy of mechanism. The simpler, the smaller that you can make something, inherently there's going to be less vulnerabilities, less errors, etc. I mean, this is just simply the idea that like we as humans, we cannot write bug-free software. Any bit of software is inherently going to have some bugs, some vulnerabilities in it. And so the more complex your system is, the larger, more software there is, right? It increases your attack surface. So to make your system more secure, to reduce the attack surface, right? KISS, keep it simple and small. So that's the idea here. Very good security practice. Another one of these kind of security practices that they updated is they merged zero trust and trust but verify. These are very similar concepts. So fundamentally zero trust, right? This is the idea that trust nothing, verify everything. This is a very pervasively used principle nowadays in security, and it's a very good idea, right? You should never trust anything, right? There is no trusted network, for instance. You should never assume that just because you have a boundary firewall and you've got your internal network, right? It's not your trusted internal network. I bet you've seen diagrams. I certainly have many times over my career. Thankfully, not much lately, but I remember seeing lots of diagrams that would be labeled, right? The untrusted network was the internet, and then you'd have your corporate firewall, and behind the corporate firewall, you'd have your trusted network. No, right? There is no trusted network. Always assume the attackers are going to find a way in, and presuming they're going to find a way in, you need to make sure that your systems are properly secured, even if the attackers have managed to break into your network. And of course, this is only exacerbated by the fact that everything's moving to the cloud. And so we're taking data that used to be safely ensconced, on our on-prem systems, and we're moving that data into software as a service applications in the cloud, exposed to the raw internet. And of course, if you're putting your data in an application that's exposed to the raw internet, you cannot trust anything, or right? Zero trust. So this is why it's such a good security practice. Trust but verify is highlighting an important point. You cannot just focus on preventative controls. You have to think about having a complete control. And by the way, a complete control is a combination of three things at a minimum: preventive, detective, and corrective. So that's what Trust But Verify is really getting at, is that you want to have complete controls. Don't overly, like, prevention of course is very important, but inevitably someone will still get through your preventative controls. If that occurs, you need to be able to detect and correct, respond to that appropriately. So that's what Trust But Verify is. Like, we'll trust you, but we're going to verify. We're going to have those detective and monitoring controls in place, which is an important part of Zero Trust. So that's why they kind of merged those. Okay, this is a new thing here. Secure Access Service Edge, SASE. This is a term that was coined by Gartner in 2019, I think it was, not that long ago. And they kind of define this as being the future of wide area networks. So the rationale behind this, and here's why Gartner coined this term SASE. Of course, what's happening more and more and more is that companies' IT infrastructure are kind of like dissolving in the sense that, it used to be pretty contained, right? You'd have your data center, all of your systems would be in that data center, safely ensconced behind a corporate firewall, boundary firewall, and all the systems would be, in one environment. And of course, that's no longer the case, right? With the proliferation of cloud services, tons of stuff has been taken out of systems that used to be, on-prem, and that stuff's been put in the cloud. And then combine that with the trend towards remote work and the massive escalation in remote work because of COVID. Tons of people are working from home now. They're working remotely. And so you've got all this data all over the place, right? Your employees are no longer just working from the office. Your data, your systems are no longer just in your data center. Everything's all over the place. Your customers, your employees are working from all over the place. Your data, your systems is all over the place. And so we need fast and efficient networks that can connect these disparate pieces together. It's no longer the simple hub and spoke, right? We need ways of connecting employees to data without having to probably go through the corporate network, because that's just going to add a ton of latency. So SASE is all about, and this is why it's Secure Access Edge, how can you get systems and services as physically close to your users, to your employees as possible, but still maintain security? And that's really what SASE is about, is this whole suite of technologies to build the future of wide area networks. So it combines the ability to provide wide area network capabilities to connect these disparate services together, but also provide a ton of security. And I don't think you need to go into all the detail of this. There's a lot to this, but SASE is essentially, you can think of it as the future of wide area networks, to get data and services as close to the end users as possible, but still maintain security. Okay, a little bit of new terminology here, operational technologies. So there's been the concept of industrial control systems on the exam for a long, long time. But a new bit of terminology that was introduced here in the exam outline is about operational technology. And here's really all you need. Here's the kind of the simple definition of this. Operational technology is a broader term. It refers to all the hardware, software technology that's used to monitor, control physical processes, devices, systems, and industrial control systems. So this is basically all of the stuff that you'd have for, computer systems, networks, etc., within an organization. And then industrial control systems is a subset of that. Specifically, what industrial control systems focuses on is exactly what it sounds like, the industrial control systems, the actual really critical software that controls the manufacturing robots, the pumps in the nuclear power plant, the water treatment plant. So I would suggest you just remember this. Operational technology is a broader term of which industrial control systems is a subset. And you do need to know a bit about industrial control systems. You need to be able to recognize these different technologies as being types of industrial control systems. So SCADA, DCSs, PLCs, these are types of different industrial control systems. And you definitely need to know about how you would go about securing industrial control systems. That's an important concept for the exam. There's a minor rewording here. They just add the word API to this. Okay, related to, as part of cryptography, specifically symmetric cryptography, the Achilles heel of symmetric cryptography is symmetric key distribution. How do we securely distribute these symmetric keys? And a new method is mentioned in the exam outline, which is quantum key distribution. So the traditional ways of securely distributing symmetric keys is, first of all, out of band. Out of band just means some alternate secure communications channel. So if you were communicating with someone over the internet, the way to send the key out of band would be to send it via carrier pigeon or fax it to them or do what we do here in Canada, a dog sled or something. So that's out of band. not new on the exam. Of course, the major way that we securely distribute symmetric keys is using asymmetric cryptography. We use key exchange protocols like Diffie-Hellman or IKE, the Internet Key Exchange. Or we use what's often referred to as hybrid cryptography, where you'll encrypt a symmetric key with an asymmetric key in order to securely distribute that symmetric key. A really common protocol that does that is TLS. So again, those are nothing new. What is new here is talking about quantum key exchange. And this is a really cool idea. It relies on the idea of quantum entanglement, which I am not remotely qualified to talk about. But the idea here, and it's very cool, is that you can entangle particles such that when you make a change to one particle, that change is like instantly detectable on the other end. And so you could, the theory here is you could build, and this is being tested right now, you could build a key exchange method where you could essentially instantaneously communicate a key to someone anywhere else. And what's really cool is you could do this in such a way to achieve what's referred to as unconditional security, which means you could know definitively if someone tried to listen in on that key exchange. Because of quantum entanglement, you can see if someone's sort of listening in, or because it's going to affect that quantum entanglement. So this has the promise of being able to essentially instantaneously communicate keys and do it in such a way that you could know with certainty if someone listened in on that communication. Pretty cool. So not practical quite yet for the most part, but probably soon and going to be very cool. All right, another minor rewording here. Some more minor rewordings. I'm not going to go through all of these. More minor rewordings. And here we go. Here's the brand new section that was added. So you're probably thinking, oh, this is really important. I better study this. Not so much. All right, here's what it's about. It's about information system lifecycle, which is the entire lifespan of a system, right from its conception all the way to its decommissioning, right? That's the information system lifecycle. And that will look something like this. The information lifecycle is starting with making sure you've understood the requirements, gathered, validated those requirements, done your requirements analysis to identify what are the risks. You've then architected the system and made sure the right controls are designed to mitigate those risks. You then properly develop and implement the system. You can then, as part of development, you can do integration testing of the different components of the system, and also integration of the system to other components that are out there, other systems that it might need to, if it's a web server, it probably has to communicate with a backend database server. You're then going to do before you go live, you're going to do a bunch of verification, validation, and then you have to actually put the system into production. And then you have to, as part of the system lifecycle, that the system will then be in operation for potentially years, and you need to do ongoing maintenance, proper change management, configuration management, backups, recoveries, all that sort of stuff. And then eventually you might retire, dispose of the system. So that's the information system lifecycle. Now, if you've been studying for the exam, especially Domain 8, this is going to look deeply familiar because here's, of course, the software development lifecycle, right? You start with gathering your requirements. It starts with initial planning, then gathering your requirements, then your architecture, design, development, testing, release, deployment, right? The only thing that's missing here is integration. Another quick clarification here. I just said everything's the same here except integration. But the keen-eyed among you are noticing that, hang on, it says verification and validation here, and it says testing down here. Those are obviously not the same things, but they are. Verification and validation, those are two critical things that you do as part of overall testing. So different words that are used here, they both mean testing. As part of development and especially development, you're absolutely doing integration testing as part of development. So it may be listed here, but this is absolutely something you're doing as part of the software development lifecycle. And now you might be wondering, well, hang on, the SDLC only covers up to it when a system goes into production, right? Because the SDLC is just the system development lifecycle, right? Just covers the development. Well, what covers the last two pieces, the operation and eventual disposal of the system, that's your overall system lifecycle. And so fundamentally, right, the information system lifecycle is the exact same thing as the system lifecycle. It's the same thing. So here's what I'd suggest, right? This is a perfect example. If you've already got CISSP material, books, things like that, they will all talk about the SDLC and the SLC, which is just what this information system lifecycle is. So I would suggest there's nothing massively new that you need to study here. Okay, Let's talk about domain 4. And this is the domain where there is by far the most new material. So buckle up. We're going to be talking about this section for a while here. All right, we're going to start with some rewordings. Again, as usual, I'm not going to go through these in any great detail unless there's something new like this. So there was a word here added to this, which was Anycast. So this is the different transmission methods that you probably already know about if you've been studying for the exam. Unicast, multicast, and broadcast. Unicast is one-to-one communications. So if just two users are just talking to each other across the network, that's unicast. Multicast is when you send out a user, send out a packet to a bunch of different users. That would be multicast. And then broadcast, of course, is one to all. So if you sent a message that was meant to go to everyone on the network, that would be a broadcast. So those already existed in the exam outline. What's new is Anycast. And what Anycast is about is nearest or best. So where Anycast is particularly helpful is when you're using CDNs, content distribution networks. And I'll talk about these more in a little bit detail later on as well. But fundamentally what a CDN is, a content distribution network, it's about getting data as physically close to the user as possible. So like I live in Victoria, BC, right? A CDN would be about having data on a server here in Victoria, or maybe at most over in Vancouver. And that way, if I want to load a file, if that file is coming from a server that's just a few miles from my house, that file is going to load extremely quickly. So organizations have been doing this for decades, right? There's companies that specialize in this, like Akamai and others, and of course all the big cloud providers and many others do this. They create content distribution networks to get data as physically close to the users as possible. And this is where Anycast comes in. If I say I want to access a video on YouTube, what Anycast will do is make sure that I'm connected to to the closest server, or at least the one that will provide the highest performance for me, and not one on the other side of the planet. So Anycast transmission technologies are about connecting a user to whatever is the nearest or best source of some file on, say, a CDN. So that's Anycast. Okay. Nothing new here. These are just, these are very important protocols. You absolutely need to make sure you need to know about IPSec, SSH, SSL, but they're listed here, but this was absolutely already on the exam outline before. Here's some new terminology. The InfiniBand and ExpressLink. These are examples of converged protocols. And converged protocols have existed on the exam already. Like, for instance, you already need to know about fiber channel over Ethernet, iSCSI, voice over IP, etc. These are converged protocols. These are two new ones you need to know about. So InfiniBand is ultimately about providing RDMA, remote direct memory access. In other words, providing access to memory remotely, wherever it might be stored on the network, as quickly as possible. So this is a protocol that's meant to, if you've got systems spread across your network, and like where this is particularly helpful is if you're doing like really high performance computing, supercomputing type stuff, doing things like training machine learning algorithms, you often need to access data all across a matrix network. And InfiniBand is a protocol that you can use to very quickly access remote data, remote memory across a network. And Compute Express Link is about connecting CPUs to other components, memory, other devices across the network, again, as quickly as possible. So these are two protocols hyper specialized to very efficiently access remote memory, InfiniBand, or to Compute Express Link to allow the CPU to very efficiently, the CPU in one system, to access the memory in another system or a device on another system across the network. And by the way, the reason these are called converged protocols is we're running this traffic typically across like a TCP/IP network that are other data packets, things like that are going across. So we're putting these new protocols on top of our existing networks. That's why they're called converged protocols, because we're running all these protocols through our same TCP/IP network. Okay, we're going to spend a little time on this one. Transport architectures. So I want to first walk you through a bunch of terminology here. So let's start with what is a topology. A topology defines how devices are interconnected. And I'll give you examples of topologies here in just a minute. You can have things like a bus topology or a star topology or a ring topology. So a topology defines how devices are interconnected. Now, when it comes to actually moving data across the network, we have what's called the data plane. So for example, within a switch, you have a data plane within the switch. And the data plane is what's actually moving the packets around, right? Because what's a switch supposed to do? When a packet comes into a switch, based on the IP address or the MAC address of that packet, the switch will send it to a particular port, to a particular system. And it's what you can think of it as being the data plane is it's the actual sort of components within the switch that actually move the packets around. If a packet's coming from here, from this port, the data plane moves it over to that port. So the data plane moves the packets around. I'm not going to get into it quite yet, but there's two different ways the data plane can kind of move packets around. You can use what's called cut through or store and forward. I'll define those for you in a minute. Before I do, I want to talk about two other planes, the control plane and the management plane. So the data plane, just as a reminder, moves the packets around. Versus the control plane. The control plane is the intelligence. The control plane is actually what determines, okay, this packet should go over there or it should go over there. It determines the path. So the data plane just moves the packet based on the direction of the control plane. So the control plane is the intelligence, the smarts. And then the final, even smarter overarching plane is the management plane. And the management plane is for the overall sort of intelligence configuration of the network. I'll define those more in a minute, but this is how these kind of pieces fit together. And let's first start by talking about topologies like I promised. So this is not new. This is stuff that's been on the exam for years, but here are the major network topologies you should know about. Bus topology, tree, star. A star topology is, what we use a lot of times now, right? A star topology is like a switch. And, in a star topology, all the systems are connected to that switch. And then you have a mesh topology. That's where everything is interconnected to everything else, right? If you want really high bandwidth, really high redundancy, mesh networks are great. And then a much less used technology nowadays is a ring topology. It's still important to know about all of these because even our modern day systems, they might be interconnected as like a physical star topology, but if the way that they're communicating might actually be operating like a bus topology where everything is interconnected to everything else. So the point is this, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Make sure you know these topologies. Okay. Now, a physical topology is the actual physical interconnections, right? The network switch plugged into this switch, plugged into that router, another cable, from running from this router to that switch. The physical topology is the actual physical linkage between different devices and how they're connected together. And then on top of that, you can actually have different logical topologies. So the logical topology defines how the data is actually flowing across that physical network. And the reason it's important to differentiate between these, right, is you could, for instance, right, from a hardware perspective, you could have a star topology, right? You could have a switch and each of the systems are plugged into the switch. So physically it's a star topology. But if the systems are sort of sending broadcast messages across the network, logically, that's actually a bus topology, right? Where everything is interconnected to everything else. So logically, that would be a bus topology. So the point is, these are separate from each other. You can have one physical topology and a separate logical topology. Okay, here's a slide that defines these different planes. And I'll make this as simple as possible, right? The data plane is the doer. It's what's actually moving the packets around. The control plane is the intelligence. It's deciding what route and deciding basically where a packet will be moved. So the control plane tells the data plane what to do. And then overarching, controlling the control plane, you have the management plane, which monitors overall network operations and things like that, and helps with maintenance and stuff like that. So if you need to take part of your network down for maintenance, the management plane would take care of that and tell the control plane what to do, etc. And then here's the difference between cut through and store and forward. So cut through is as soon as a switch receives a packet and is able to read the header, it'll just forward it on. That's cut through. So as soon as a switch is able to read even just the start of the packet to see where the destination for that packet, the switch will just forward it on immediately. So this provides excellent performance, but there's no error checking involved. So cut through provides the absolute best performance, but because the switch isn't actually reading all the packet before it forwards it on, you don't have any error correcting and some of the other cool capabilities that a switch can do. Store and forward, exactly what it sounds like. Before forwarding a packet on, the switch will receive the entire packet, look at the entire thing, and therefore can check for errors and things like that before forwarding it on. So store and forward is going to give you reduced performance, but it'll give you additional capabilities to do things like error checking. All right, some performance metrics. So this is new material that's mentioned on the exam outline. So let me walk through some various performance metrics that you should know about. Start with bandwidth. Bandwidth is the overall theoretical maximum that a network connection could possibly provide. So the keyword here, theoretical, right? Bandwidth is theoretically what's the maximum amount of data we could shove through this Cat6 cable or this fiber optic cable. That's bandwidth, theoretical maximum. Throughput is the actual, right? We've all experienced this, right? We'll have a gigabit home network, or like we'll have, a 1 gig connection to the internet, and you're usually not getting like even though your service provider will say, oh yeah, you have a fiber optic 1 gig connection to the internet, you're typically not getting a gigabit of throughput. So throughput is the actual rate of successful data transfer through the connection. Signal to noise ratio, this is important. You obviously want to try and minimize the amount of noise on a connection, because the more that you can minimize the noise, and therefore the stronger the signal is, the less chance there's going to be of lost packets, corrupted data, etc. So signal to noise ratio is where you're measuring this. And like a great example of what you have to be careful of is if you take like unshielded cat cable and you run it past, like on the ceiling past like neon lights. Neon lights give off often, especially if they're broken, quite a strong magnetic pulse, and that can corrupt the data passing through that Cat6 cable on the copper wires. So this is why if you wanted to reduce the signal to noise, if you wanted to try and eliminate that, you could use shielded Cat6 cabling. It's more expensive, but it'll give you a much higher signal to noise ratio. Your data, you're gonna have higher throughput. You're not gonna have as many sort of corrupted packets. Latency is the amount of time for a packet to do a round trip. So if I'm sending a packet to a server and then waiting for that packet to come back, latency is how long is that round trip, typically measured in milliseconds. And then the final one here, jitter. This is the inconsistency in latency. So if I send a packet and it took 10 milliseconds, and then I send another one and it takes 100 milliseconds, and then I send another one and it takes 2 milliseconds, that's jitter, right? You've got this bouncing up and down in the latency. So you obviously want low latency. You want packets to come back and forth as quickly as possible, and you want low jitter. You don't want the latency to be jumping up and down. So these are important metrics to monitor on your network. You want low latency, low jitter. You want a high signal to noise ratio. You want high throughput, etc. Okay, let's talk about traffic flows. And there's 2 bits of terminology you need to know about here: north-south and east-west traffic flows. And ultimately what this is about is it's about understanding the data that's coming into and out of a data center and how that data is moving within the data center, or even maybe to adjacent data centers. So the reason that this north-south, east-west traffic is important to think about is how do you optimize for throughput, for security, for different types of protocols. When you're designing, securing, data center network, you have to think about north-south, north-south, east-west communications. So here's the difference. North-south is the data between the data center itself and the customer. So like, let's say we're talking about like a cloud data center. North-south would be the communications that's going between the customers out on the internet and the data in the cloud data center. That's north-south, between the data, like data in and out of the data center to customers, which is very different than east-west. East-west is the data that's passing back like within the data center itself, or to, for example, a lot of cloud providers will have what are referred to as availability zones. They'll have 2 or 3 data centers interconnected. East-west traffic would be the traffic passing back and forth between those data centers within an availability zone. That would be east-west. Or the data traveling between a compute node and a storage server within the same data center. That's east-west traffic. Traffic flowing within the data center itself. And so here's some definitions. So like I said, north-south, this is data coming between the customer and the data center. If you think of the data center being up in the cloud, right? If a customer is sending data to the cloud, that's northbound communications. From the customer to the data center, up in the cloud, that's northbound. Southbound traffic is data leaving the data center and going to the customer out on the internet. That's southbound traffic. And then, like I said, east-west, that's traffic moving within the data center itself. Okay, let's talk about segmentation of our networks. And depending on what you want to achieve, There's some different, how important security is for you and how much you're willing to spend. There's some different segmentation options here. The first here, in-band management. This is not, like the slide here says physical segmentation. Inbound is not physical segmentation. Because what physical segmentation means is creating a physically separate network. That's physical segmentation. In-band is not physical segmentation. So here's what in-band would look like. Let's say you've got a switch on your home network or your corporate network. If you're connecting through just kind of the standards user network, if you're connecting through that network to the switch, the same network that everyone else uses, if you're connecting through that network to log into and manage the switch, that would be considered to be in-band management. Because there's just one network, and through that one network, you're using it to connect the switch. This is obviously the least secure. Much more secure would be to have a separate out-of-band management network. So if you wanted to be able to log in and say manage your switch, you could have a separate out-of-band network connection for that. A separate, physically separate network. That would be out-of-band management. Much more secure. And then air-gapped means a completely separate network. In other words, there's no connection whatsoever between this network and that network. That's air-gapped. And where air-gapping is primarily used is, or often used, is with industrial control systems. If you've got like a really critical industrial control system network, like the pumps and actuators for the nuclear power plant, typically the way that you'll protect that industrial control system network is through air-gapping. Complete and total segmentation, physical separation of that industrial control system network from any other network on the planet. That's air-gapping. And it's obviously the most secure. Okay. From a logical segmentation perspective, let's talk through some things here, how we can logically segment networks. And by the way, most of this is not new. Like VLANs has already been on the exam for many, many years. I'm not going to talk about that. VPN's not new. The only thing that's new here is, compared to the previous outlines, is virtual routing and forwarding, VRF. And this is basically the idea that within a single router, you can have different routing tables. So essentially, like instead of having to buy a separate router to route traffic differently through VRF, you can essentially have one physical router essentially emulate multiple virtual routers. So that's virtual routing and forwarding. And then a virtual domain is essentially doing this, basically sort of creating your segmentation, your logical segmentation at the virtual machine level. Sorry, I think I'm getting tired. So it's the ability to create sort of network segmentation like right at the device level. So like on a virtual machine, for instance, you could set up the firewall on that virtual machine to segment that virtual machine or create whatever segmentation you wanted. So that's virtual domains. Ability to create separate security domains within a single physical device, within say a firewall, for instance. So within the firewall, you can create different firewall rule sets. Okay, micro-segmentation. This is a very useful concept. I mean, segmentation overall is a very good idea. And micro-segmentation is where so let me take a step back. A traditional way of doing segmentation is you might have, here's the sketchy internet over here, and then here's your corporate network over here. And of course, you don't want people out of the sketchy internet to be able to access the systems in your safe corporate network, in your trusted network. Don't have a trusted network. Where we would often put our publicly facing systems, like web servers, things like that people on the internet need to be able to connect to, we would put those systems, we refer to them as bastion hosts, you would put those bastion hosts in a separate network segment referred to as the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And so this is very basic network segmentation. You know what, let me get pictures with 1,000 words. Let me quickly draw this. Let me show you what I mean. So here's our sketchy internet here, right? It's the evil internet. All right, and then traditional network segmentation might look like this. You'd have your firewall, and then sitting behind that firewall, you'd have, some sort of router or switch or something like that, and then some happy users sitting behind it, and they're all nice and safe from the internet, right? And now let's say you want to run a web server. A terrible idea would be to run the web server here inside your network, right? Because that means you're going to have to allow traffic through your firewall into your internal network in order to access that web server. So you don't want to do that. And this web server would be referred to as a bastion host. So here's a traditional way of doing this. You would create a separate network segment here where you would put these publicly facing systems, things like your web servers and maybe your Exchange server, your email server or something like that. And you'd connect them up to your firewall. And the advantage here, right, is by creating this separate networking segment, the DMZ here, the demilitarized zone, you're going to have some firewall rules that are going to allow traffic from the internet to these systems. But of course, that's going to make sure that even if an attacker manages to compromise this web server here, that shouldn't allow them, back into your internal network. So that's the idea of segmentation, right? Been around for decades, ever. The idea of micro-segmentation is, instead of having like the DMZ here with a bunch of different systems in it, let's start to segment even further. So, because like for instance, the firewall rules that you need to have in place for the web server are quite different than the firewall rules you have to have for the email server. If we just have one DMZ, we have to have rules in place that allow traffic for both of those different systems. So the idea here of moving towards micro-segmentation is you can essentially start to put more firewalls in place. So you could put, say, a dedicated firewall just in front of the web server and a dedicated firewall just in front of the email server. And the big advantage here by putting these dedicated firewalls in front of a server like this is the firewall rule set can be really tight, right? Just a very few rules in it. So you can really lock down your firewall rule set, and it also significantly reduces traversability, right? Like, so if this web server gets compromised, well, the attacker is just stuck, right? Like these are now separate network segments. So even if this web server gets compromised, the attacker is just stuck in this little tiny network segment and they can't even get over and see the email server. So this is the idea of micro-segmentation. And the reason that this has become so popular lately is a lot of this is being done, of course, in the cloud. And instead of having to buy physically separate firewalls, which is expensive, you're using virtual firewalls, which are, basically free. So micro-segmentation has become a lot more popular recently because of all the virtualization and being able to do this like micro-segmentation. Basically, it's very easy to set up and it's not much cost to implement this in, say, the cloud, in infrastructure as a service in the cloud. So that's the idea of micro-segmentation. Okay, let's go back to the slides here. Sorry, it takes me a minute to erase this giant board of glass here. Okay, so the idea here, right? Each segment can have its own security policies and controls, right? You can have a separate firewall in front of just the web server. So you can really tighten down that control, that policy set, the firewall rules. So here's some terminology related to this. Network overlays encapsulation. This is the idea of creating a virtual network that is abstracted, overlaid on top of a physical network. A way of doing this is with a software-defined network. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Next, distributed firewalls. This is the idea that we can basically, instead of having one central firewall, we can build, say, like a virtual firewall, or we can add a firewall capability to, say, our individual virtual machines or our containers. So we're essentially distributing our firewall rules and building sort of small virtual firewalls into a bunch of individual devices, essentially allowing you to achieve micro-segmentation. You can have distributed routers, same idea. You can distribute the routing rules to individual workloads. So instead of having one central router, you can distribute some of the routing intelligence to individual devices. And then as part of monitoring, you want to have IDS, IPSs. Not new, so I'm not going to talk about it. And we already talked about the idea of zero trust. Zero trust is like sort of implementing micro-segmentation is one of the important ways that you can achieve zero trust, right? Trust nothing, verify everything. You can achieve it. One of the ways that you can help achieve zero trust is through micro-segmentation. Okay, edge networks. I already talked about this, right? In the sense that I talked about a content distribution network where you're trying to get, in a content distribution network, you're trying to get data as physically close to the user as possible to try and reduce latency and so forth. And edge networks are a perfect example of that. Although edge network is a broader term. A CDN is just about getting content as close to the user as possible. An edge network is a broader term that means getting not only data content as close to the user as possible, but also computational power. And this ties back to what I talked about with SASE. SASE is about trying to get, create an edge network, get data processing as physically close to the user as possible. But SASE, of course, is about doing it securely. So just remember, edge network. It's all about trying to reduce latency, trying to reduce how long it takes for a user to get access to something by getting it as physically close to the user as possible. A bit of terminology related to networking and edge networks here. Ingress is the traffic that is entering a network. Egress is the traffic that's exiting a network. And peering is the interconnections between different networks. So for example, a lot of internet service providers will have peering arrangements. So like here in Canada, Bell, TELUS, Rogers, they have peering arrangements where they will send traffic between themselves. Within the US, you'd have, between AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, etc. These different internet service providers have peering agreements amongst themselves. So rather than a packet having to go out onto the global internet and then come back, the packet could just pass directly from the AT&T network into the Verizon network. That would be a peering arrangement. Okay, nothing exciting here. They added Bluetooth, they removed Wi-Fi, minor rewording. Okay, SDN is not new to the exam. SDN as a topic has been around for a long time, but it is kind of pointed out here. And so I'm going to spend just a second on here. Like, what is a software-defined network? Fundamentally, what a software-defined network is that a software-defined network allows you to create multiple virtual networks on top of a single underlying physical network. And SDN as a technology is fundamental to how the cloud works. You can't have the cloud without having software-defined networks. So, like I said, in really simple terms, an SDN, a software-defined network, allows you to create multiple virtual networks on top of one physical underlying network. And this is a very complicated topic that I'm not going to get into too deeply, but one of the defining characteristics of how an SDN functions is in how the control plane and data plane, where these pieces are. So if you remember me talking about these, right? The control plane is the intelligence that determines where packets are going to move. The data plane is what actually moves the packets around. In a traditional network, so what this is meant to show is this is a traditional switch. This is a traditional dish switch. This is a traditional switch. In a traditional network, each device will have its own control plane and data plane built into it. So each switch is making decisions as to where to move packets and then moving the packets themselves. So the switch has both the control plane and the data plane built into it. When you move towards a software-defined network, one of the major changes is that you centralize the control plane. So you still have physical switches spread across their network, and those physical switches are still moving the packets around. The difference is the intelligence is no longer built into each individual switch or router as to how it's going to move packets around. Instead, in a software-defined network, you centralize all of that in one central control plane. And one of the big reasons you do this is it makes it much, much easier to reconfigure the network and move things around as you need to by having one central control plane. Like, let's say a device goes down. If a device went down in a traditional network, you might have to go around and actually change log into individual switches or router to reroute traffic. With a software-defined network and a centralized control plane, if something goes down, the centralized intelligence can recognize it and then just reconfigure, change the rules basically for all the devices across the network to move traffic, to reroute traffic as necessary. And this is one of the fundamental building blocks required to achieve a software-defined network. VPCs, virtual private clouds. This is the idea that a cloud provider will create a logically isolated environment for you. This is actually a really important point, right? A lot of people want to use a private cloud because it's a more secure environment for them to store their data or their systems. And a lot of people, when they hear when they hear private cloud, they think, that's some dedicated hardware to just me. That's not what a VPC is. A virtual private cloud, there's no physical isolation. There's no physically separate hardware. A VPC it's a logically isolated environment. So it's meant to provide some additional sort of separation and security, but it's only through logical isolation, not physical isolation. That's a VPC. Okay, there's some new terminology here around monitoring and management that'll take you through. I mean, ultimately, if you want to have a network that's going to be performing well, you need to ensure the availability, the performance, the reliability of that network through monitoring. And so here's some different terminology related to this. Network observability is your ability to see what's happening on your network, to gain insights into what's happening. Are certain devices overloaded? Did something just go down? Ideally, what we would want to aim for here is having a single pane of glass view. Through a single interface, we can observe our entire network and see what's going on. Traffic flow shaping. This is where you can keep track of what data is growing across your network and prioritize certain things. So for example, it's really common within corporate networks to prioritize voice over IP traffic. So, if someone's having a call through voice over IP, you want those packets to have priority because you really notice, right? If you're talking to someone on the phone and there's a delay, it's really irritating. So this is the idea of traffic flow, traffic shaping. You can prioritize certain protocols like voice over IP. Capacity management. This is the black art of trying to predict the future, of trying to look to see and sort of estimate what our future demands going to be of the network and when do we have to upgrade to meet those future demands. Thankfully, capacity management is becoming, for a lot of organizations, a lot less important. Like, this is really hard to do. And the reason this is becoming less important for a lot of organizations is because they're moving to the cloud. And the cloud provides rapid elasticity and scalability. You can quickly scale up and scale down whatever you need. And that can, implemented correctly, help reduce the need for doing capacity management. Fault detection handling, exactly what it sounds like, right? If something breaks, if something's having errors, you need to be able to detect that and do something about it. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that you need to do from a performance monitoring perspective, but it's nothing new for the exam, so I won't talk about it. There was just a simple wording change there from they changed the word hardware into infrastructure. They added some examples here, nothing exciting. Some more examples were added. Minor rewording, minor rewording, minor rewording, and some examples were added. And then, yeah, there was just a bunch of more minor rewordings there. So yeah, there you go. Nothing exciting there. Okay, domain 5. Whew. This is taking a while. Hopefully you're finding this helpful. All right, here's domain 5. Here's the major changes. And as usual, we'll go through them one by one. This will be a pretty quick one. So they added a new line item here about services. All this is referring to is, the whole point of identity and access management is to control access to any sort of asset. An asset is just anything of value to the organization. And so what's of value to the organization? Certain information, certain systems, devices, applications, and certain services. So I would suggest there's really nothing new here. They just added the word services. Fundamentally, right, any access control system is not anything new. Any access control system is about controlling access to assets, anything of value to the organization. And services are services, right? Infrastructure is a service, platform is a service, hosting services, managed IT services. You, of course, need to, as part of your identity and access management controls, you need to control access to these assets as well. Okay. There's a subtle bit of terminology here that you need to know about. The concept of roles was on the exam before, and the concept of and the terminology of groups has existed for many years, but this is new to the exam only, so I'll explain the subtle difference. Roles are essentially function-oriented, function-centric. So for instance, you would create a role of call center agent level 1. And that role is specific to a function, right? To a call center agent level 1 function. And that role is what defines the permissions. And then of course, the way role-based access works is once you've created a role, you can then assign that role to someone. And the role is what's going to define their access. So that's the idea of roles. And the key word here is they're function-centric, right? A role is based on a certain job. Someone needs to perform in an organization, like be a call center agent. Groups are instead collections of users. So you can have a group of users. And groups are user-centric. So this is another way of assigning permissions, but it's to think about it a little bit differently. Instead, you say, okay, we have this whole group of users. What access do we want to assign to this whole group? That's the subtle difference between them. Okay, there is a rewording here, but nothing new. So the exam now specifically calls out AAA. Let me show you what this is about. So like in our book and what we've talked about in our classes for many years is the 4 key access control services: identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. And of course, identification is how someone asserts their identity through like a unique username or account number. And authentication is how someone verifies their identity. Authorization is where you apply the principles of least privilege, need to know, separation of duties, right? You only give someone, you only authorize someone, you only give them the access they need based on their job. And then accountability is making someone accountable for this is where non-repudiation comes in, right? You make someone accountable for their actions. So we've talked about this for years. If you hear the terminology AAA, all it means is just you're basically dropping the identification, because AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. So slight difference in terminology here, right? Instead of accountability, it's accounting, but it's absolutely the same principle. So that's AAA, right? Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. It's just a simplification. It just drops identification. And by the way, the 3 factors of authentication that you need to know about are knowledge, ownership, and characteristic. Those are the 3 factors of authentication you need to know about. The other new piece that was added here was around passwordless authentication. And this is becoming much, much more popular. How can we move away from passwords? Because there are so many issues with passwords. How can we move away from them? And so there's a bunch of different ways that we can use, that we can provide passwordless authentication, that we can authenticate someone to a system without asking them for a password. So we can use things like biometrics or OTPs, one-time passwords based on a device or security token or something like that. So why do we want to do this? Well, a huge advantage of moving away from passwords is it absolutely provides increased security. It can make it easier for a user to log in. And one of the major reasons is it can help to significantly reduce the risk of phishing. So if someone receives a spear phishing email and the attacker somehow captures their password, the attacker can now easily gain access to that person's account because they have their password, right? This is why we hate passwords, because if an attacker gets that password, they can now really easily use that password to gain unauthorized access. The big advantage of most passwordless systems is there's no little bit of information that the attacker can capture, right? Because if you're authenticating to your laptop using your mobile phone, right, the attacker would actually have to somehow reach through if they're doing a spear phishing attack, they'd have to somehow reach through your email and get your phone, which obviously they can't do. So that's the big driver for a lot of passwordless authentication, is it helps significantly reduce the risk of phishing attacks and an attacker gathering a password. There are, of course, downsides, right? If you log into your laptop using your phone and you lose your phone, you're now locked out. Biometric systems have various concerns with them. I won't talk about that because that's nothing new to the exam. And this can be more expensive, right? If you're requiring, UB keys, things like that for your employees, those cost a lot more money than a free password. So there's cost implications as well. Okay, password vaults. This is a very good security practice. The idea of a password vault is it's a system that's meant to securely store a bunch of different passwords, right? It's an application designed to store and manage credentials. And the big advantage here, right, is that I don't know about you, but I can't remember more than just a handful of passwords. And yet I need access to like hundreds of different systems. And so the traditional way of doing this, right, is you just use the same password across every single system. The massive problem here being, of course, is that if an attacker gets your password from one system, they can just reuse your email address as your username and your password on all these other systems and break into all the other systems. So by using a password vault, the big advantage is you can generate a unique, super strong password for every single system. You can have a different password for every single system, which you could never remember, but you don't need to because they're all stored in your password vault. So that's the advantage. And it also makes it easier to share passwords if you need to, things like that. Of course, the massive downside here is that if your password vault is compromised, that's bad from a security perspective. I'm looking at you, LastPass. They just had a couple of major breaches. So there's obviously risks here, right? You've got to be very concerned about the security of your password vault. Okay, access policy enforcement. This is where we have to talk about PDPs and PEPs. So what are these things? Ultimately, this is about where is the decision, like what's making the decision as to whether or not someone or something can get access to a system, and then what's actually enforcing that decision. So the policy decision point, as the name implies, this is the decision maker. So the policy decision point would be the system that's responsible for making a decision as to like, okay, is Rob allowed to access that system? The PDP, the policy decision point, would make that determination. And then the PEP, the policy enforcement point, would enforce that decision, would actually let me through or block me from accessing a system. So these two systems obviously work together, right? The policy decision point makes the decision, and the policy enforcement point enforces that decision. It acts as the gatekeeper. Some more minor rewordings here. There's a new item here around service account management. Service accounts are accounts used by applications, other services, etc., not by humans. And just because it's an account that's not being used by a human doesn't mean you get to ignore the security of it, right? If a web server is using a service account to access a backend database, you still have to be very concerned about the security of that service account. And so service account management is about how you manage these service accounts. There you go. That's service account management, the process for configuring, monitoring, and maintaining these service accounts. Okay, Domain 6, security assessment and testing. For the most part, a lot of rewording here. You can see what the changes are. They just added some examples here. A new bit they did talk about or add here is the location of where you're conducting your assessment from. So you have a few options here. On-premise, an on-premise assessment means that you would be, if like let's say you're the auditor, on-premise assessment would be you're auditing the system within the organization's own environment. Because on-premise means, like within the company's own data centers or systems. So an on-premise assessment is for an in-house organization-owned system. Of course, everyone's moving to the cloud now. So a cloud-based assessment is where you're assessing a system in the cloud. And I would suggest the interesting bit here is a hybrid assessment. What hybrid assessments are primarily focused on is the interconnection between on-premise systems and cloud-based systems. And so, because if you're using cloud-based systems, it means you're letting your users remotely log into those systems. You're often transferring data to those systems across the internet. How do you make sure that there's a secure connection? A hybrid assessment would be where you're specifically looking at that connectivity between the on-premise systems and the cloud-based systems. That's the focus of a hybrid assessment. I'm glad this was added. Red, blue, oh my goodness. Red teams, blue teams, and purple teams. So this has been around, this is an idea that's been around for a long time, and it's becoming much more popular. So I'm really glad that ISC2 added this to the exam outline. So here's what red team and blue team is all about. Your red team is your offensive security team, right? Your red team is your simulated hackers, right? They're there. The red team is the threat. And so the red team is doing ethical hacking, penetration testing, trying social engineering attacks, spear phishing attacks, things like that, and doing the threat intelligence. So your red team, right? This is your in-house folks that are the attackers, right? They're your simulated attackers. And the blue team is the defenders there, right? The blue team is focusing on defensive security monitoring, incident response, forensics, things like that. The blue team there is there to stop the threat. So it's really helpful to have two different teams focused on these two different things, so they can each get very good and be specialized at that. And then here's where purple team it's not a team. Here's where purple comes in. Purple is not a separate team. What purple is you want your red team and your blue team to collaborate, to work together. Like, yes, it's good to have a bit of friendly competition between your red and your blue teams, but you don't want it to be adversarial to the point of, they'll hide stuff from each other. They won't work together. So purple is where you focus on this collaboration between the two teams so they can take lessons learned from each other. They can both get better. They can better secure the organization by collaborating. That's purple. And obviously all three are important. Red team, blue team, and purple collaboration. More not very important stuff here, rewordings, some examples added, things like that. There's just examples added of, like, it's the same thing at the start actually, examples. And then the same thing was talking about location here, on-premise, cloud, hybrid, but we already talked about that just a second ago, so I won't bore you with it again. Okay, Domain 7, security operations. Again, a lot of rewordings here, nothing major. They moved the concept of SOAR from Domain 8 here into Domain 7. They added tuning here. I will briefly mention this. This relates to security information and event management systems, SIM systems. And tuning is one of the major things you're doing when you're tuning a SIM system is you're trying to reduce the number of false positives. False positives is where the SIM systems goes, ooh, something bad is happening here. And then you look into it and there's not actually anything bad happening. That's a false positive. And you obviously want to try and reduce those false positives as much as possible, so you don't get things like analyst fatigue, right? If the system is constantly generating false positives, you're going to get analyst fatigue, right? It's the problem of crying wolf too many times. If the system is constantly generating false positives, then very quickly the analyst is just going to be like, just ignore the stupid thing. It's always doing that. And then when a true positive occurs, they'll ignore it. So you want to try and tune the system to reduce the false positives, but not to the point where you start getting false negatives. False negatives are super dangerous. A false negatives is where something bad is happening and the system is not generating an alert. Super dangerous. So that's that's the art of tuning. Trying to reduce false positives, but you don't want to desensitize your system to the point where you start getting false negatives, which are super dangerous. Not new stuff here. There's a new item here around protecting data at rest and in transit, but there's nothing new to talk about here. Like the exam has talked about for decades how you go about protecting data at rest and in motion, often through things like cryptography, right? You can encrypt data in motion, you can encrypt data at rest. So it's a new item, but it's nothing new there's no new material there. Okay, there's some material here on backup storage strategies, and an important thing to think, so the point of backup storage strategies is you're determining what data is backed up, where that backup data is being stored, and how you're going to recover that data and try and minimize things like loss or corruption of the data. So that's all of that is encompassed within your backup storage strategy. And this is often, I don't think this will be on the exam, but this is a big part of what this is about. You often want to have the 3-2-1 rule. You want to have like 3 copies of a critical file. You want to have 2 backups on different media, and one of those backups should be stored off-site in a geographically remote location. So this would be an example of what you'd be looking, the 3-2-1 rule is an example of what you'd be looking at as part of your backup storage strategy. So on-site backups, this is obviously where the backup is on-premise, right? If your server is here, an on-site backup would be having the backup tape or backup server sitting right beside it. That's an on-site backup, which is good for quickly recovering data, but not good if your data center burns to the ground, because then you lose the primary system and you lose the backup. So that's why you typically want to also have off-site backups. So even if your data center burns to the ground or has a massive power outage, it's flooded, there's a hurricane, whatever, you've got off-site backups. And ideally at a geographically remote location. And by the way, geographically remote is not any set distance. It's just far enough away that whatever disaster is taken out at our primary site doesn't take out the recovery site or doesn't take out the backups. So that's the idea with off-site backups. You want them to be geographically remote. And then cloud. This is what a ton of organizations are doing nowadays, is they're moving towards and using the cloud as their backup strategy solution. Because of rapid elasticity, because of cheap storage. It's very cheap, potentially, to store data in the cloud, and it can provide very, very high availability for your backup data. So a lot of organizations are using cloud for that nowadays. Resource capacity agreements. So this is another new item. And this is in relation to recovering if something bad has happened. So the idea here, you want, pre-arranged agreements with vendors such that if a disaster, a disruptive event occurs, the organization can ensure that it has the resources it needs. It's just like what I talked about kind of at the beginning there as well. So I wouldn't suggest this is a super important one. Some more kind of minor rewordings here. Nothing super important. Okay, final domain 8. Does it feel like we've been here for like a week at this point? All right, so let's get into it. So the scaled agile framework, this is a new bit of terminology that's added here. And of course, what this is getting at is a development methodology. There have been many, many, many development methodologies created over the years. One of the grandfathers is the waterfall methodology, right? It's called waterfall because, water only flows downhill. So the waterfall methodologies, you have to go through a certain number of phases. You have to do them in order. You can't go backwards. And if it takes you a year to go through your waterfall methodology, if someone wants to make a change in the middle, too bad, right? You got to wait till you can't go backwards and change the requirements mid process. So you got to wait, maybe 6 months, and then we can start the next iteration. So waterfall is sometimes, kind of criticized for being a bit inflexible. And that was kind of the genesis of Agile. Agile is just the waterfall methodology, but done much more rapidly. Instead of taking 6 months, a year to go through waterfall, you basically go through the waterfall in Agile. You go through the waterfall methodology usually once every 2 weeks. You have a 2-week sprint, and it just makes for much more rapid iteration, more feedback loops, etc. So Agile is just basically waterfall, but done in sprints. And then here's the new terminology, the scaled Agile framework. Is just how do you apply the Agile methodology to a very large organization, right? How do you scale Agile? That's what the scaled Agile framework is how can very large organizations use Agile and ensure collaboration across multiple teams, etc. I'll briefly mention these. DevOps, of course, very popular nowadays, definitely on the exam. And how do you secure your DevOps? This is where you should use DevSecOps or SecDevOps or rugged DevOps. These are different DevOps methodologies that have security baked into the DevOps methodology. So if you're concerned about security, you should be using a variation of DevOps that has security built into the methodology, like SecDevOps, DevSecOps, etc. Okay, here's a new piece, interactive application security testing. So in domain 6, the testing domain, for years, we've talked about static application security testing. Static implying that the code is not running. So what are you doing in static testing? You're looking at the source code. The inverse of this is dynamic application security testing. This means the code is running. So what are you doing in dynamic application security testing? You're looking at a running system. And what interactive application security testing is it's the combination of both SAST and DAST together. So you're testing an application that's running while still being able to actually look at the source code. That's interactive application security testing. Okay, and then they removed some cloud service model. They removed the reference to cloud service models here, and then they just added it here. So nothing new to talk about there. And cloud is not a massive topic on the CISSP exam, but it is an important topic. So you definitely need to spend some time on cloud. Okay. We've made it. I don't know if you stuck with me till the end here, but if you did, I hope you found that helpful. So that is all of the major changes that are happening on the 24 exam. And yeah, it took us a while, but in the grand scheme of things, this is not big changes to the CISSP exam. So I hope you found that helpful. Last little, I'll give myself a little plug here. Last thing I'll say here is that if you watch this video, especially to the end here, right? You're probably looking at passing the CISSP exam. And if you're looking for the easiest way to pass the CISSP exam, you should check out our CISSP Masterclass. Myself, my team, we have been building our CISSP Masterclass now for many, many years. We've been refining it. My business partner and I, John, he's been teaching CISSP classes for well over 20 years now. I've been teaching for over 10. I would suggest we have this down to a bit of an art. We're darn good at it, and we love doing it. And we've spent so much time and so much effort creating our own custom system and learning system and everything to make it as easy as possible for you to become a better security professional and pass the CISSP exam. And the reason that we've made it as easy as possible is we've developed all of our own learning materials, all of our own custom slides like the ones that you've seen here. And a whole integrated learning system that includes a practice test, this knowledge assessment system, our own practice question app and flashcard app. And all of these, so we have all of our own, let me put it simply as possible. We provide all of the materials, everything that you need to confidently pass the CISSP exam. And here are all the various learning tools. The masterclass, we have super high quality recordings of myself and John teaching all of the topics that you need to know for the CISSP exam. And of course, we're heavily into the process right now of creating new videos and updating and adding new videos to our masterclass. There's gonna be over 200 videos now when we make the big update. We have detailed explanations. We've written our own book on all of this material. We have something called the mind maps, which are also available for free on YouTube. We have over 1,500 references built into our system of references to other CISSP guidebooks, useful websites for reading about certain things. We're really good at exam strategy. They're not complicated techniques, but we have a few simple and very effective proven techniques that you can use to most effectively read an exam question, understand what the question is asking you, and therefore pick the best answer. So we provide that as part of our masterclass. And yeah, I mean, through all of this, through this whole integrated learning system, this is how we make it as easy as possible for you to pass the exam. And our pass rates reflect this. Our current pass rate is hovering somewhere around 93, 94%, somewhere in there. And I don't like to toot my own horn, but that is a super impressively high pass rate. I can't share the actual numbers, but the global pass rate for the CISSP exam is catastrophically lower than that. And I'd suggest if you see pass rates that are published by some other training providers, often their pass rates are based on not first-time pass rate. First-time pass rate means when someone takes our class, and then they go take the exam. And 93.6% of our students take our class, go and take the exam, and pass on their first attempt. Other numbers that you'll see out there are usually, maybe the person had to take the exam 2 or 3 times before they passed. And then if you sort of, once they eventually pass the exam after 2 or 3 tries, then you can say, oh, well, we have a 95% pass rate. But I don't know about you. I would never want to do the CISSP exam more than once. I wrote the CISSP exam, or took the CISSP exam, back in 2005, and I still remember it. It was, back then, 6-hour exam with a pencil. It was a brutal exam. You don't ever want to have to take the CISSP exam more than once. So I'm really proud of this pass rate. We've worked super hard to achieve this, and we care so much about our students and doing everything that we possibly can to make sure that you can learn the material that you need to confidently pass the exam on your first try. And if you want to hear from our students, we have a bunch of success stories published on our website. You can look us up. We got a bunch of Trustpilot reviews. I think our student success stories speak for themselves. So yeah, check us out if you're looking for the easiest way to pass the CISSP exam. You can find all the info on our CISSP masterclass here at desert.com/CISSP. And whatever approach you take in your studies, I wish you all the very best. And good luck on the exam. Take care.